The library at Bramfield Hall was the quietest room in the house, which was why Clara had chosen it. The party had been audible since before dinner, the orchestra in the east wing, the doubled footfall of 23 guests across marble, the sustained bright noise of a household determined to present itself at its best. Clara was not among the 23. She had been seated at the far end of the dining table with the elder Miss Prentice, who was pleasant but nearly deaf. And she had spent the meal speaking into the woman's better ear about topics that would not embarrass either of them. Now it was 9:30, and she had excused herself with the practiced grace she had developed over 3 weeks of learning how to become invisible on demand. The library was in the older wing, past the portrait gallery, at the end of a corridor where the house party did not go. Clara had found it in her second week at Bramfield Hall and had taken to visiting it in the evenings when Lady Eugenia was occupied with her embroidery or her mother. The shelves rose to the ceiling, and the room smelled of beeswax and something older, a scent she had decided was simply the accumulated weight of books that had not been hurried. A small writing desk stood beneath the east window, its surface worn smooth at the center, and she had appropriated it without permission from anyone because no one had seemed to know she was doing so. She was writing a letter to her sister Harriet in Gloucestershire. She had been writing the same letter in pieces for several days, adding lines when she found the quiet to do so, setting it aside when she did not. Tonight she had managed 2 paragraphs about the gardens at Bramfield before she heard the door. She did not look up at once. The footsteps were quiet. A man's, measured, unhurried, and she assumed it was one of the footmen doing his evening round of the lamps. She wrote another half-sentence. Then the footsteps stopped. She looked up. The Earl of Bramfield stood in the middle of the room. He had not lit the lamp nearest the door. He stood in the light that reached him from the 2 candles she had arranged on the desk, which was not much light. His coat was dark, his cravat precisely tied, his posture the same composed stillness she had observed from a distance for 3 weeks without ever being able to read what it meant. He was looking at the desk. Clara set down her pen. His expression did not change, exactly. It did not reorganize into anything she could name. It simply became very still in a way she had not seen it be still before. Not the controlled stillness of a man in company. The stillness of a man who has opened a door and found something waiting behind it that he had not expected. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I will leave." She began to gather her letter. "Stay," he said. She stopped. His voice was level, as it always was. She had not yet heard it anything other than level, but there was something in the single word that was different from command. Not quite request. Something older than either. She laid her letter back on the desk surface, her hands flat beside it. He stood in the same place for another moment, looking at the desk. Then he turned and went to the shelf nearest the window, where he appeared to be looking at the spines of books, though she did not think he was reading them. The room settled around them. Outside, the November wind pressed against the glass. "Shall I extinguish my candles?" she asked. "If you require the room." "I do not require the room," he said. He pulled a volume from the shelf, glanced at it without opening it, replaced it. "I only came to find some quiet." "Then we are here for the same purpose," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, very briefly, something almost like amusement crossed his face. She caught it in the candlelight, the faint compression at the corner of his mouth, and was gone. "So we are," he said. He chose a chair near the fireplace, at a distance that propriety would not have complained of, even had a chaperone been present, and he opened the book he had taken from the shelf without looking at which one it was. Clara returned to her letter. The fire crackled. The party, far away, went on without either of them. She wrote 2 more sentences about the gardens, and then she found she could not write any more, because some part of her mind that she had not asked was occupied with the man sitting 12 feet away, reading a book whose title she did not know, in a room he had apparently come to for the same reason she had, at the same hour, without any arrangement between them. When she gathered her letter at last and prepared to leave, he rose. That was all. Simply rose, in the way a gentleman rises when a woman stands. She said good evening. He inclined his head. She walked to the door. At the threshold she paused, without intending to, and looked back at the desk, at the small worn surface, the 2 spent candles she had left burning. She had a sudden impression of it as something that had sat a long time in its particular place, waiting to be used again by someone who did not know what it had been. She did not know what it had been. Not yet. She went out. Clara Ashbourne had arrived at Bramfield Hall on the 28th of October, having traveled by post-chaise from London with a small trunk, a letter of introduction from her former employer, and the particular kind of composure that comes not from confidence, but from having practiced it long enough that it resembles the same thing. She was 24 years old. Her father, the Reverend Mr. Ashbourne, had died in March, leaving a comfortable library, a warm memory, and debts that had obliged her elder sister to take a situation and Clara to find one. She was well-educated, soft-spoken, and sufficiently attractive in the way that rooms full of beauties could afford to overlook entirely. She had had one season, 6 years ago, when her father's finances were briefly better, and she had returned from it without understanding what she had failed to do correctly. She had not gone back. Lady Eugenia Vane, the Earl's younger sister, had met her in the entrance hall with such unguarded warmth that Clara had spent the first evening wondering whether the girl was simply young or genuinely kind. Within a week, she had concluded it was both. Eugenia was 19, laughed easily, asked questions without cunning, and had already shared more information about Bramfield Hall and its inhabitants than Clara would have asked for. It was through Eugenia that Clara had learned about the house party, the invited guests, her own peripheral role during it, and 3 weeks into her employment, over a shared pot of tea in the morning room, the matter of the letters. "It is the one thing people always say about Edmund," Eugenia said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "And I have never been entirely certain what to make of it." What did they say? That he burned them. Every letter she had ever sent him. 3 days after she died. Eugenia looked into the cup. Miss Cecily Harmon. They were engaged. She caught a fever and did not recover, and then Edmund burned everything she had written, every note, every letter, the whole of it. And people said... She stopped. What did people say? That he had grown cold to her before she died. That he had been distant for months and that she knew it. And that burning the letters was his way of making it clean. Of not being held to account for something he was relieved to be free of. Eugenia set down her cup with some precision. I do not believe it. I want you to know that. I have never believed it. Edmund is not a man who performs feeling he does not have, and I have seen him in the years since, and there is nothing relieved in him. He simply does not speak of it, and he did not defend himself when people said those things. And I have always thought, that not defending himself was its own sort of answer, only not the one they assumed. Clara did not ask what she thought it meant. She filed the information away in the quiet manner she had developed for information about the household, which was to acknowledge it and set it at some distance from herself, where it could not interfere with the work of being a companion. She had become, over the past several years, expert at distance. It was her most reliable tool. She could stand in a room full of people whose concerns were entirely unlike hers and remain present enough to be useful, removed enough to be unhurt. Her one season in London had taught her that much, if it had not taught her anything else. She had watched other young women gather the season's attention around themselves as naturally as they gathered shawls, and she had understood, without bitterness, but with a kind of clear-eyed resignation, that she was not that sort of person. She was not the kind of woman rooms noticed. She was the kind of woman rooms required in order to function, the one who ensured the elder guests were attended to, who found the misplaced gloves, who remembered the allergies and the seating arrangements, and the particular way Mrs. Somebody preferred her chair turned toward the fire. This was not nothing. It was simply not what she had once, very briefly, hoped to be. She had stopped hoping in a specific direction around the time her father's health began to decline, which had also been around the time she understood that the finances were not what they had appeared. The two revelations together had a clarifying effect. She had been 22. She had put away, in the same deliberate manner with which she now filed household information, the particular small shape of wanting to be chosen. That had been 5 days before the house party began. She had since refined her understanding of the distance she was meant to keep. The guests arrived over 2 days. Miss Honoria Pelham arrived with her mother in the early afternoon of the first day, and Clara, watching from the upper gallery, observed her descend from the carriage in a pale blue pelisse, calm-faced, graceful, her glance at the house measured and comfortable rather than impressed. She was precisely the sort of woman who did not need to be told she was welcome. She walked in as though she already knew the dimensions of every room. Lady Meredith Vane received her with an warmth she had not displayed toward anyone else that morning, including her own son, and Clara noticed that too, and filed it at the same careful distance. The rose garden conversation occurred on the third afternoon of the house party. Clara had been directed to walk with Lady Meredith and Miss Pelham along the garden paths after luncheon, a task that consisted primarily of following at a slight remove and speaking when addressed. Lady Meredith and Miss Pelham walked ahead of her, and Clara had fallen back enough to examine the late-season roses, which were browning at the edges but still present, when she heard Lady Meredith's voice drop into the register that meant something not intended for her. "She is only the companion," Lady Meredith said quietly to Miss Pelham. "She is here for Eugenia. You need not concern yourself with her, my dear." Miss Pelham said nothing that Clara could hear. She continued walking, her pelisse perfectly arranged, her back expressing neither agreement nor the absence of it. Clara kept her gaze on the roses. Her face did not change. She was very well practiced at that. She did not know whether Edmund had heard it. He was not in the garden. She had not seen him since the morning, when he had been speaking with his steward in the courtyard about something that required the steward to produce a folded document from his coat pocket. She had watched from an upstairs window. She had not intended to watch. She had been going somewhere else, and the window had been there. And something about the directness with which Edmund listened had held her attention longer than she had planned. He did not perform attention. He simply gave it, fully, to whatever was before him, as though it had his entire regard, because it did. She was thinking about this, in the rose garden, when she heard his voice. "Miss Ashbourne." She turned. He had come into the garden from the far gate, from the direction of the stables, and he was standing 2 rosebeds away, looking not at his mother or at Miss Pelham, but at her. "My lord," she said, "I am going to the gallery to look at the condition of the east frame. Walk with me." Lady Meredith turned at this, her fan stilling in her hand. It was not a request. It had not been phrased as one, and the oddity of it was visible on his mother's face, quickly controlled. Clara set down the browning rose she had been holding and fell into step beside him, leaving the garden through the far gate, while Lady Meredith stood very still behind them. He said very little in the gallery. He did examine the east frame, a gilt piece showing significant damage at the left corner, and he asked Clara whether she had any view on the restoration question, which she did, and she shared it, and he listened in the way he listened to everything. She found herself speaking about gilding and the particular difficulty of restoring varnish over leaf without disturbing the ground beneath, which was knowledge she had from her father, who had cared about such things for reasons she had never entirely understood, and she talked about it perhaps longer than she had intended, because she was speaking to someone who was not being polite in his attention. He was simply attending. When she stopped, he asked a question that indicated he had heard every word. When they returned to the rest of the party, he resumed the composed distance that was his natural condition in company, and she resumed her peripheral position, and nothing between them had been resolved or declared. She did not examine this too closely. She was, she reminded herself, only the companion. Only she was somehow warmer than she had been, which she did not know what to do with, and she filed that at a distance too. She was very practiced at distance. She had simply, this afternoon, found that distance required rather more effort than usual. If you are wondering, as I believe you may be, what kind of man does not defend himself when a county decides the worst of him, stay with this story a little while longer. The answer is there. It is worth finding. She found him in the kitchen garden at 20 minutes past 6 in the morning, 4 days into the house party, when she had risen early to avoid the assembled guests at breakfast. The air was cold enough to render her breath visible, and she had not properly anticipated this in the matter of her coat, which was wool but not heavy wool, and she was walking fast enough to manage it. The kitchen garden was walled and orderly, with the last autumn cabbages still in their rows, and the bare frames of what would be peas in spring. She came around the corner of the cold frame and stopped. Edmund Vane, Earl of Bramfield, was kneeling in the kitchen garden, in the dirt, in his coat. Beside him crouched a girl of perhaps 7 years, the head gardener's youngest daughter, whose name Clara had learned was Nettie. Nettie was inspecting a seedling with an expression of deep personal grief. The seedling was a small thing in a clay pot, and it was listing badly to one side. Edmund was examining it with the full seriousness with which he had read the steward's document. He was not performing interest for the child's benefit. He had not lowered himself to her level in a performative crouch. He had simply gone down on one knee, because that was where the seedling was, and he was looking at it. "The stem," he said to Nettie, "is still intact. Do you see? At the base, here." He indicated without touching. "The root has not come loose. The pot was knocked, not the plant. This is recoverable." Nettie wiped her face with the back of her hand. "She fell over in the night," she said. "I found her fallen." "Then we will set her upright," he said. He reached into the soil and adjusted the position of the clay pot with the care of a man moving something precious, and the seedling stood again. He sat back on his heel and regarded it. "There!" Nettie regarded it too. Her expression shifted from grief toward something cautious. "She might yet be well," she allowed. "She will be well," he said, in the tone of a man who had decided it. "Water her this afternoon, not before. The morning cold is not good for a root that has been disturbed." He stood, brushing his knee, and looked up. He saw Clara standing at the gate. Neither of them spoke. The morning light was the pale, flat kind that comes before true sunrise, and it did not flatter or dramatize. It simply showed what was there. He had soil on the knee of his breeches, and a seedling he had risen before 6 in the morning to attend to, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no word for. She looked back. He said nothing. Nettie had already trotted back toward the gardener's cottage, the crisis resolved. Clara should have said something. "Good morning. I apologize for intruding." But she found that she had not said anything, and that she was walking back to the house, and that she was aware, in the back of her neck and all down her spine, of the fact that he was still standing in the garden behind her. She did not look back. Her face was warm despite the cold. She thought, walking up the path to the kitchen door, about a man who did not perform. A man who simply gives whatever is before him his full regard, as though it is worth it, as though the question of whether it deserves the attention does not occur to him. Only the thing itself, and its need, and him. And this was the man they had decided burned letters out of indifference. She did not believe them. The library scene she had not been able to stop thinking about arrived again 2 evenings later, though this time she went to the library knowing it was not only the quiet she was going toward. She told herself it was the letter she had not finished. She brought the letter. She sat at the small writing desk, lit her 2 candles, and had written perhaps 1 sentence before the door opened. He was earlier than last time, or she was later. He crossed the room without any appearance of surprise that she was there, though she could not have said whether he had expected her. He stood near the desk, looking at it, in the way he had looked at it before. She waited. "That desk," he said, "belonged in my study. I had it moved here when I found I could not sit at it." Clara set down her pen. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I did not know it had any particular significance. I will not use it if... I did not say I wanted you to stop using it." She was quiet. He drew a chair from near the window and sat down in it, not close to the desk, at an angle that meant he was not quite looking at it. His hands were on his knees. He was a man who knew how to hold still, and yet this particular stillness cost him something she could see, even in candlelight. "Miss Harmon wrote her letters to Bramfield Hall," he said. "They came to me in my study. That desk is where I read them." He did not look at the desk while he said this. He looked at the middle distance, at nothing in particular. "After she died, I burned them. You have likely heard the reason County assigns to that." "I have heard what County says." "And what does County say?" She met his gaze. "That you had grown cold to her." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the house party was proceeding with its music and its brightness well away. "County is wrong," he said. "What happened was simpler and worse." He paused. "She was unwell in the autumn." "A cough," her physician said. "Nothing to worry about. Rest and warmth and no travel." "I wrote to her. I was distracted. I had the estate business and a matter with my solicitor that wanted my attention, and my letters to her in those weeks were shorter than they should have been." She read the shortness as a cooling. She was not wrong that my letters were shorter. She was wrong about what it meant. He stopped. "She wrote to say she was coming to Bramfield," he said. "In spite of the weather. In spite of her physician. She wrote that she needed to see my face. To assure herself that I still..." He did not finish the sentence. "She came. The journey worsened the cough. What became of the cough was the fever. She died 3 weeks before our wedding." Clara did not speak. There was nothing to say that would not diminish what he had said. "I burned the letters," he said, "because the last one, the one telling me she was coming, in spite of everything, because she needed to see my face, I could not stop reading it. I read it until I could not see the words any longer, for knowing what the reading of them had cost her." He looked at his hands briefly, then returned his gaze to the distance. "I burned them because I needed, eventually, to choose to stop," which felt like a betrayal of a different kind. It is still not clear to me that I was right. It is done. Clara thought of a January evening in her father's study, 2 weeks after his burial, when she had taken his letters from their box, the old ones, from before she was born, from her mother to him, bound in a faded blue ribbon, and had simply held them for an hour without opening them, because opening them would have made her know something she was not ready to know. She had put them back in the box. She had not opened them since. She was not sure she was right either. I think, she said carefully, that the choice to stop is not the same as forgetting, nor as growing cold. He was still for a moment. Then he looked at her. She held the look. It lasted perhaps a breath longer than she expected, and then he looked away. And yet his hand had moved during the moment. She saw it in the candlelight, toward the surface of the desk, where her hand was resting near the letter, and stopped and returned to his knee. Not quite a touch, the absence of one. No, he said, they are not the same. If you have stayed this far, you already know something the drawing room has not worked out yet. The question is only what Edmund will do with it. Stay. The shape of what Lady Meredith intended revealed itself at dinner on the 5th evening of the house party, when Clara arrived to find that her place card had been moved from its usual position at the lower end of the table to a position not at the table at all. Honoria Pelham sat at Edmund's right hand. Lady Meredith sat at his left. The table was arranged with the deliberateness of someone who has spent years understanding what the arrangement of bodies in a room can communicate, and Lady Meredith was a woman who had never underestimated that knowledge. The table communicated a verdict without words. Here was where consideration fell. Here was where attention pooled. Here was the woman who was the correct choice. It communicated these things quietly, almost politely. And that was what made it effective. Clara had been directed by the first footman, with perfect courtesy, to a side table by the window, where 3 of the elder guests whose hearing required a quieter setting had already been arranged. She took her seat. She ate her soup. The elder Miss Prentice, on her left, was telling a story about a house party in Derbyshire. She was watching the main table when she heard it. A woman she did not know well, Mrs. Radcliffe, the wife of Edmund's neighbor, leaning across to a companion in a voice pitched for the side of the mouth, but carried further than intended by the particular acoustics of the corner. "She is only the companion," Mrs. Radcliffe said. "She was at every outing this week, which I thought was odd, but evidently Lady Meredith has sorted it." Clara ate a spoonful of soup with the steadiness she had been practicing for 6 years. She looked at Edmund. He was turned toward Miss Pelham, listening, with the composed attention he gave everything. He was not cold. He was simply fully elsewhere. She watched his face and thought that he did not know, and then that perhaps he did not think it required him to act. And then, which was the darkest thought of the 3, that perhaps he did not disagree. She finished her dinner. She excused herself. She went to the library. She sat at the small writing desk, and she thought about London and the employment agency, and what she had heard from other companions about situations of this kind, and she concluded, with as much steadiness as she could manage, that it would be better to write the letter tonight and give it a day before she sent it. She did not want to act from the dark moment. She wanted to act from the settled place, and she needed the night to find it. She took a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote, "Dear Madam, I am seeking a new situation." She got no further than that. She set down the pen. The library was quiet. The fire in the hearth was lower than she had kept it, and the room was darker at the edges, and she sat in the candlelight at the small worn desk and was honest with herself in the way she had promised always to be, even when honesty was inconvenient. She did not want to go. She was clear enough about her own situation to know what that meant, and she was clear enough about his to know what it could not mean. And these two clear things sat in front of her like objects on a table that did not belong to the same set. He was the Earl of Bramfield. She was only the companion. Lady Meredith had arranged the room that evening with the efficiency of someone who did not regard the arrangement as cruel, only as correct. And it was correct. In the way the world had always determined correctness, which was to say that it had nothing to do with what she felt in this room, at this desk, with the candles burning. She looked at the worn spot in the center of the desk surface that her own wrist had begun to polish smooth over 3 weeks, a small addition to its history, unwitnessed by anyone who would have thought to note it. She understood now why he had moved the desk to the library, where it could be a different thing. Not the desk where grief arrived, but a desk where a person might come to find some quiet, and eventually to write at again, and eventually for the weight of it to shift, not disappear, only shift, toward something it was possible to carry, rather than be buried under. She thought about how he had chosen to stop reading. He had chosen, eventually, to let the desk be something other than what it had been. She picked up the pen again. She did not write anything further to the employment agency. She wrote instead to Harriet, her sister, who had always been more sensible than anyone else Clara knew, and in whose opinion Clara placed a great deal of trust, and to whom she had not yet told half of what there was to tell about Bramfield Hall. What she did not yet know was that Eugenia Vane had spent the length of that dinner pressed against a rage she was not practiced enough to contain, and that by 9 o'clock she had gone and found her brother. The guests departed over 2 days, and the drawing room on the penultimate afternoon of the house party was the place where everything that Lady Meredith had been carefully constructing reached its finish. Clara was in the drawing room because she had nowhere else to be. Eugenia had a headache, real or manufactured, Clara could not say, and Lady Meredith had not instructed her to withdraw to the companion's usual orbit. She stood near the window, holding a cup of tea she had not asked for, watching the room arrange itself as it had been arranged all week around the central pair of Miss Pelham and whatever verdict Lady Meredith intended to make public before the guests dispersed. Lady Meredith stood near the fireplace, composed, her tone carrying the specific brightness that Clara had come to recognize as preparation. "My son is, as you all know, somewhat reluctant to." Lady Meredith paused, smiled, managed the pause perfectly. "To make his intentions clear, I believe you will find that he has made considerable progress in that direction over the course of this week." Honoria Pelham, seated near the window, did not look at Clara. Her posture was the same as it had been all week, settled, certain, arranged. She was the correct answer to a question that had been asked before Clara arrived. "Of course," Lady Meredith said, to the room at large, with the lightness of a woman completing a small thing. "We must not trouble Miss Ashbourne with any of this. She is only the companion, after all, and she has her own small concerns." Clara set down her cup. Her hand was steady. Then the door opened. Edmund Vane did not stride. He walked into the room at his ordinary pace, with his ordinary composure, and for the first moment Clara thought he had simply arrived late to an afternoon gathering he did not much want to attend. He crossed from the door toward the fireplace. Then she understood that he was not going to the fireplace. He was walking toward her. He came across the full width of the drawing room in the same composed, unhurried manner, and the room understood before Clara did what was happening, because the room went quiet in the way rooms do when something is about to become irrevocable. Lady Meredith's bright expression altered. Miss Pelham's hands, in her lap, did not move. Edmund stopped in front of Clara. He looked at her. Only at her. "Clara Ashbourne is not only the companion," he said, in the same level voice he used for everything, which somehow made it more rather than less. "She is mine." The word carried the whole room. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at Honoria Pelham, who sat very still by the window. He looked at Clara, and she looked back at him, and the cup of tea she had set down sat on the side table behind her, and the fire in the hearth went on burning, and the clock on the mantel went on ticking, and nothing in the room moved. Then she heard Lady Meredith say, from the fireplace, very quietly, "Edmund?" "I believe," Edmund said, still looking at Clara, "that Miss Ashbourne and I require some time." He offered his hand. Clara looked at it. She looked up at his face. There was nothing in his expression that she could call either desperation or calculation, only the straightforward attention he gave to whatever was before him, which happened at this moment to be her. As though she had always been worth it, as though the question of whether she deserved the attention had never, for a single moment, occurred to him. She put her hand in his. They walked out of the drawing-room together, through the door, into the corridor, where the house was quiet, and the sounds of the party, such as remained of it, were well away. He stopped in the middle of the corridor, in the area near the portrait gallery, where the afternoon light came through the tall window at the end, and made the corridor feel like something from another century. He turned to face her properly. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me an explanation," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly, but a recognition. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I do." "Eugenia told me you were coming," she said. "She told me last evening that she intended to tell you what had happened. I did not ask her to." "I know," he said. "She told me that as well," with some emphasis. He was quiet for a moment. "Eugenia told me about the dinner, about what was said and about what was done this afternoon. I was not present for either. I should have been. You could not have known. I should have paid closer attention to what my mother was doing." He said it without self-pity and without excuse, in the way he said everything. "She is not a cruel woman. She is a woman who has decided what is correct and proceeds accordingly, and she proceeds with considerable skill. I should not have allowed the week to proceed as it did." Clara looked at him. She thought about the drawn room and the table at dinner, and the particular brightness in Lady Meredith's voice when she said only the companion, and how she had drunk her soup. "It does not require a formal apology," she said. "I am accustomed to occupying that position." "I am aware that you are," he said. "That is rather the thing I am trying to address." She was quiet. "I should like," he said carefully, as though he had considered the words and found them insufficient, but intended to use them anyway, "to discuss whether you would consent to remain at Bramfield Hall in a different capacity than the one you currently hold." "A different capacity," she said. "A permanent one," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the window at the end of the corridor and fell across the portrait of his grandmother, a woman who looked out of the frame with the same composed attention he had. She thought about the desk in the library, and the worn spot on its surface, and why he had moved it from his study to a room where it could become something else. She thought about the seedling in the kitchen garden, and Nettie's grief, and his hands in the soil at 6:30 in the morning, when no one would have known whether he had gone or stayed. She thought about the last letter he had burned, and the line he could not stop reading, and the choice he had made to stop, which was not indifference, but something older and more difficult. "I would consent," she said, "to discussing it." The guests were gone by the following afternoon. Miss Pelham had departed with her mother, with the gracious composure of a woman who understood she had lost but did not intend to show it. Lady Meredith had withdrawn to her own rooms, not in anger, or not only in anger, but in the way of someone who has been shown that the world does not behave according to the script she had been given for it. Eugenia was radiant and contained herself imperfectly. Bramfield Hall without the house party was a different place. It breathed. Clara was in the library on the evening of the third day after the guests departed. She had lit her 2 candles on the small writing desk and was writing a letter to her sister. She had been writing it for some time, adding and revising, because the letter was about more than she had expected a letter to need to be. She had written that she was not leaving Bramfield Hall after all. She had written that she would tell Harriet the whole of it when they met, which she believed would be sooner than either of them had supposed. She heard the door. Edmund Vane stood in the doorway with a book under his arm and looked at her, and at the desk, and at her again. "You are still writing at that desk," he said. "I am," she said. He crossed the room. He did not take the chair by the fireplace, which was the chair he usually took. He came to the desk and stood behind her, looking at what she had written over her shoulder, which was a liberty that she had not granted him, and did not resent. "To whom are you writing?" he said. "To my sister Harriet. Telling her I will not be returning to London after all." He was quiet for a moment. She was aware of him, his height, the warmth of him at her back, the distance between the back of the chair, and the nearness of where he was standing, which was very little distance. She did not move. "What does she say to that?" he said. "I have not sent it yet." "Ah?" he said. He reached past her, not touching her, to pick up her pen from where she had set it beside the inkwell. He turned it in his fingers once, as though considering it, and set it back. "I find," he said very quietly, "that I prefer the library when you are in it." His hand came to rest on the back of the chair, just above her shoulder. Not touching her. The warmth of it was present anyway, inches from her shoulder blade, from the nape of her neck, from everything in her that was aware of exactly where he was in any room. She did not turn. He did not move. Outside the library windows, the first snow of the season had begun. She could see it in the dark beyond the glass, not falling heavily, only beginning. The particular soft arrival of the first snow of any winter, uncertain of itself and undeniable. The fire in the hearth was the color of embers, orange and deep. The desk was warm in its light. The room smelled of beeswax and old books and, faintly, of the cold that had come in with him from the corridor. She thought about all the letters that had come to this desk before she had ever arrived at Bramfield Hall. She thought about what it had meant for him to move the desk here, into a room that could give it a different purpose. She thought about Harriet's letter, and everything she had not yet been able to say in it. She thought about the way he had crossed a drawing room, in front of 20 people, in the same composed, unhurried manner, toward her. "Then stay," she said. He stayed. His hand did not move from the back of the chair. She did not turn from the desk. Outside, the snow continued to fall on the grounds of Bramfield Hall, on the rose garden and the kitchen garden and the long avenue of elms that led up from the gate, falling softly on everything that was his, and now hers. The candles burned. The fire burned. The desk, which had once been a place where grief arrived, and where a man had learned to choose, at last, to stop, was warm with new use, with new hands, with the particular happiness of a thing that has been given back to the world. The small worn spot at the center of its surface caught the light. It had always been there. It was simply, now, hers too.